Everyone, my name is Rabbi Amy Bardak. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh and my colleague here, Marlene Layton, I want to welcome you to this commemorative Torah study session. Today, we honor the lives lost and the people affected by the attack on three congregations, Dor Hadash, New Light, and Tree of Life or La Simcha, on October 27th, 2018, the 18th of Cheshvan, 5779. Our Torah study today is dedicated in memory of the 11 people who perished on this day 2 years ago. Please rise if you are able as we recite the names. Joyce Feinberg, Idit Baltzia, Bat Abba Menachem Vechinka. Richard Gottfried, Yosef Ben Chaim. Rose Mallinger, Razel Bat Avraham. Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda Ben Yechezkel Veselma. Cecil Rosenthal, Cecil Chaim Ben Eliezer. David Rosenthal, David Ben Eliezer. Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel Bat Moshe. Sylvan Simon, Zalman Shachna Ben Menachem Mendel. Daniel Stein, Daniel Avraham Ben Baruch. Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol Ben Yosef. And Irving Younger, Yitzchak Chaim Ben Menachem. Zichronam Livracha. May their memories be a blessing. You may be seated. I would like to acknowledge, before we get started, a few technical things. We realize it's a big time in our nation and that there could be late-breaking political news during this Torah study. At the request of some of the victims' families and the survivors, we ask that there not be political announcements or chatting about the election publicly during this call. We are leaving the chat open for you to chat with each other privately, so you're welcome to do that one-on-one. And the chat will remain open throughout the session. And we are recording this session, so be mindful of your camera, of being mute when not speaking. And we are delighted to get started with an introduction of our scholar by our own Rabbi Aaron Bisno, the spiritual leader and rabbi of Rodef Shalom congregation here in Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Amy. It's my privilege to open the session by introducing my friend, Rabbi Rick Jacobs. Rabbi Rick Jacobs is currently president of the Union for Reform Judaism, which reaches more than 1.5 million people through nearly 850 congregations, 15 overnight camps, NIFTY, the Reform Teen Youth Movement, and the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. Prior to being installed as president of the URJ, Rabbi Jacobs served as a congregational rabbi at Brooklyn Heights Synagogue and at Westchester Reform Temple in Scarsdale, New York. A long-time and devoted creative change agent, Rabbi Jacobs is recognized as a visionary thought leader who is ably navigating the reform movement through these most challenging and uncertain times that we are now confronting and living through. It's my privilege, and I'm proud to welcome and to introduce to you my friend, Rabbi Rick Jacobs.
Thank you, Rabbi Bisno. I appreciate the warm welcome. I appreciate this very poignant moment for us to be together in memory of our 11 family members. I know there are people obviously here who can say that in a very kind of real way, but our Jewish family is united across not only geography, but of time. And I feel honored to be together to do what we Jews do when we want to remember. We learn and we grow stronger and clearer, and we hold the memory even closer as we do. I'd like to actually learn with you and from you, and I prepared something that I hope will be engaging. It's going to require you to use your fingertips a little bit to have conversation through the chat, because I'd like to actually pose some things. But let me start by doing something that rabbis now have to do, which is share my screen. Let me just see, everybody seeing our Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I titled this session Pursuing Justice. And I thought, you know, we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg to remember, along with the 11 who are most immediate in front of us. But I wanted to think about, where is the place of pursuing justice within a Jewish life? And how is it rooted in the tradition? And how did Ruth Bader Ginsburg exemplify those deep, deep commitments? I want to start with a personal anecdote. 2 years ago, on that fateful day, October 27th, 2018, I was not in the United States. I was in Israel. I was actually at Kibbutz Tzuba for Shabbat. And we have a high school program that we do. It's called the URJ Heller High. And it's one of my favorite things, of the millions of favorite things I get to do in my role. And you know, Kibbutz Tzuba is just outside of Jerusalem, just spectacularly beautiful. As you can see the Judean hills in the background. So while you were all sleeping in Pittsburgh and elsewhere in North America, we were awake and we were having our tefillah for Shabbat morning. At the end of tefillah, we had a discussion with the students, and you know, I was just thrilled, whatever questions they might have. In the middle of that, one question really surprised me. One of the students raised her hand. She said, "Rabbi Jacobs, have you personally experienced anti-Semitism in your life?" And I just thought, well, that's an interesting question to be asked. Here we are in Israel. It wasn't an Israel question, it was a broader question. So I gave the answer that very seldom have I experienced anti-Semitism personally. But then I thought to myself, I'm a Jewish educator, let me ask them. I said, how many of you have personally experienced anti-Semitism in the last year? These are students from every part of the US and from Canada. And can I tell you that 2/3 of the students put their hands in the air, and they told me stories of feeling anti-Semitism at their school, in their sports, in their after-school curricular, in their involvements in their towns and cities. And I thought to myself, this is something we've not seen from high school students in North America. And of course, I filed it. I said to the director and some of the faculty, I said, this is something we're going to have to circle back to. And of course, later that day, I was poised to get back to Ben Gurion Airport and come back to the States when the news came. I put that out there because something obviously is coursing through our world. And I do think that we're going to, as a Jewish community, be returning to those questions in more frequency and with more depth going forward. But I want to just start by kind of posing, what are the core elements of Jewish life? And I do it pictorially first. If you take a look around the 4 screens, you can see examples of what Jewish life is filled with. What are the core commitments of a Jewish life? You have in the bottom left, group of students studying Torah. What could be more fundamental? The upper left, you have a group of people praying in their community. What could be more natural? You have a family, intergenerational family going for a walk on a beautiful fall day. What could be more elemental of Jewish life commitments? And then you have a picture of a guy holding a Torah scroll, marching with people that you can recognize. So in the chat, can I just hear, who is the guy holding the Torah scroll? Anybody have that? That's, by the way, extra credit. You're going to get like a bag of Zabar's bagels. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie, perfect. Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who was president of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which became, of course, the URJ, my predecessor. And he carried this large Torah scroll when he marched. And he marched often, and he marched with Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel. And he wanted to make a point that the Torah wasn't simply to be read in sanctuaries and in prayer services. It's meant to be a beacon of light in our oftentimes dark world. I also just don't know how he carried it. It was really a heavy Torah scroll, but I think it's exemplifying who he was and what he leaves us. Now, I actually want you to do something tangible in the chat. I want you to rank in the order of their importance the 4 activities I just highlighted with pictures: Torah study, Talmud Torah, prayer, avodah, fighting injustice, tzedek. We could rotate tzedek or some verb to go with justice, and caring for members of our community. Gimilut chasadim, whether it be older members or mourners or poor people. How do we care for one another? So I'd love to see in the chat. You can put in order. You can go A, B, C, D. You could go C, B, A, D. I'd love to see. Here we go. Look at that. All right. So let's see some of that. I see already ordering from. Okay, beautiful. Look at that. I see Doris and Jamie putting C first, D second. Look at that. Amy's got a Torah study. First of all, I love it. Rabbis, we like to do that. Look at the mix here. A lot of D's, plenty of A's first, and a few C's as well. Look at that. Beautiful. And by the way, there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer. How do you like that for a Jewish question? There's a way to create consensus in our community. We all have the right answer. But the truth is we order them every day in what we prioritize in our lives, right? And that is what I want to talk about today. So let's just take a look. I know it's already kind of dated. There's a new Pew Research study that's about to come out in the coming months. And that is back in 2013, they asked, what does it mean to be Jewish? So they didn't use the 4 categories I just put in front of us. They, asked people, what's core to being Jewish? The most frequent answer was remembering the Holocaust. Second was leading an ethical and moral life. Third was working for justice and equality, being intellectually curious. You can look down the list, caring about Israel, having a good sense of humor, 42%. Wow. Having a sense of humor outpaced observing Jewish law. That's a little bit scary, or maybe not. It depends on where you sit. So this is an example of the wider Jewish community answering the question I asked you one slide ago. And it turns out that, they didn't use the same categories, but I'm going to say that leading an ethical life and working for justice are near the very top of the list. So if the Pew were to answer the 4 questions that I put before you, C would have been likely the most frequent answer by Jews in a broad definition of who identifies as Jewish. I don't point that out because they're right and we're all wrong in our preferences. But if we see this as a wider phenomenon, working for justice is core to how American Jews identify their religious commitments. So now I want to just, kind of dig into some traditional texts and just to get a question of what are we talking about with social justice? I don't know about you, but I hear pretty much all the time, the reform movement, the conservative movement, you all made up social justice. It's not part of the Jewish tradition. I mean, come on, prayer, study, those are the fundamentals of Jewish life. And I would just say, can we test that assumption? Can we go back and look at the sources? So the first text is from this week's Torah portion. It's that amazing act of chutzpah when Abraham says to God in the debate over will he save the innocent at Sodom and Amorah. And it's this amazing line. Our patriarch says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat." Will the judge of all the earth not do justly? Evidently, justice is critical for God, and it's critical for those who are created in the image of God. Look at obviously the long narrative of the book of Exodus. God hears the cry. Sa'akat b'nei Yisrael hears the cry of those who are oppressed, and God responds. And that begins the larger narrative of the Exodus. We also have obviously the classic love the V'ahavta et hager, love the stranger, and in the Targum, which is one of the translations of the Hebrew into Aramaic, God does justice for the orphan and the widow. God doesn't want to just care for them and love them. God does justice. How so? Giving food and clothing, not just for Jews, but for those who are somehow part of our wider community. I make this case just because I think there's a debate raging in our community about what is authentically the work of being a Jewish person. And I'm never going to argue, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, that Torah study and prayer and caring for one another are not primary Jewish acts. But if you leave the study today and you think that justice may be an sort of an add-on recently, then I will have failed as a teacher. It is fundamental. So let's dig in a little bit more. So what about social justice and our Jewish texts? In the opening chapter of Isaiah, what is the definition? Limdu hetev, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wrong, uphold the rights of orphans. By the way, if I didn't cite where that's from and I just said it, somebody would have said, Rabbi, you're being partisan. You're doing a political message. This is core text. This is from our Haftarot. These are from our texts that we recite during worship. Look at Amos, this very famous text. Amos is preaching against a ritual obsession that all we'd worry about is holidays and prayer and sacrifices. And God says through the prophet, that's not actually what I demand. I demand justice. Let it well up like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. By the way, I don't think in any way is the argument ritual is unimportant, but ritual alone is empty. And that made the prophets not only angry, but very, very busy. Let me take us right to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think, you know, can I just set it in a context? I was asked by a major secular newspaper, the Daily News, right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, would I write an op-ed explaining why she was not strictly following the mourning customs around her death, why she didn't leave clear instructions to her family that she wanted to be remembered and mourned in a traditional way. And you'll remember that she was the first woman and the first Jew to ever lie in state at the US Capitol. You know that. It's an incredible honor. And you also know that her Jewishness mattered to her. She talked about it a lot. And in her chambers, she was very, very quick to point out that the mezuzah on her door to the chambers of her office at the Supreme Court was the mezuzah from the Shulamite School for Girls in Brooklyn where she attended. And it had on it Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. That would be probably Dayenu for most of us. She had on her walls beautiful artistic renditions of the same quotation from the book of Deuteronomy. It turns out for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this text was a watchword of what she did every day when she woke up. The work she did at the court, to her, was primary to her work as a committed Jewish person. Now, she also was pretty learned. She made her way through, sorry, went back one there, through, kind of a childhood that had traditional observance. One of the places where she broke from some of her traditional observance was around mourning her parents, and that she wasn't allowed to say Kaddish. And she felt that was unjust. So her commitment to justice even led her to a bit of a revolt within the structures of the Jewish community in Brooklyn that she had been raised in. And I just thought, in honor of her, let's poke a little bit more into that very famous phrase, which of course, like any famous phrase, often is said but not kind of delved into. So one of our great spiritual masters, Rabbi Simcha Bunim, has this beautiful reminder that justice you shall pursue, with justice you shall pursue justice. even pursuing it has to be done in a just way, not with any falsehood. So again, why repeat the word justice? Well, Rabbi Simcha says, because you have to do your justice work in a very authentic and just way. Amazingly, the Talmud in Sanhedrin 32b picks up the whole question of what is justice, justice you shall pursue mean. There they said the first mention of justice is, of course, pursuing, correct judgment. The second mention of justice is that compromise is critical to justice. Now, if that's not a heretical notion today, can you imagine a more heretical notion than compromise is a key part of doing justice? But she understood in her work that give and take was critical. The Talmudic passage gives an example. You have two ships that want to pass at the same time, they'll have a collision. So compromise is, no, you go first, we'll go second. That's built into the DNA of creating a just society. And that is so powerful. And when we think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's judicial focus, we're going to see actually that her commitment to compromise may in fact be there, although it's not often pointed out. So I want to take us into another Talmudic passage, but first I want to stop sharing, and I want to just do a little. I want to do a little question. I want to see. Put your hand in the air if you've ever protested anything in your life. In a public way, not just, that you were having chicken for dinner and you wanted roast beef. I mean, like something that brought you outside and made you stand up, maybe with a placard. Can somebody, one or two who don't mind being specific, what things have you protested for? Put it in the chat. It'll probably be easier than unmuting, but we can get a chance to do that too. What are things that you've protested for? Maybe you've protested on behalf of Soviet Jewry at some point. Maybe you've Russian Jews, beautiful Soviet Jewry. What other things have you protested? Some unfair gun violence, which of course we've had way too much of in recent years. Anybody protested on behalf of the state of Israel? Okay, beautiful. Against racism, many of us have in recent days especially. Black Lives Matter, mental health awareness, women's right to choose, the women's marches, murder of Dr. King back in '68. Look, this is a group of activists. So on one level, like I'm preaching to the choir, right? I'm talking to all of you about the centrality of justice in our tradition. You clearly already act and take those stands. So look at the way in which protest is already a part of how we see that. Now, if I asked you, did you protest because it was an act of Jewish commitment, or was that something that was some separate part of your identity? Was that your political awareness, or was it being a good citizen of whatever community you're a part of? So the next question is, where does that deep commitment in Judaism to righteousness? Remember, go back to Abraham in this week's Parsha. Our Abraham, he is a guy who is impatient with injustice, and we have fallen certainly in line behind him for all these centuries. Truth to power. Whether it's, do you remember Moses with the most powerful man on earth? Is Moses afraid of speaking truth to power? Not a chance. So again, these are fundamentals. And when people say, are you an observant Jew? How many of us would answer, oh yes, I go to protests. Very often someone asks you if you're observant Jew, they say, do you go to Shabbat services? Are you learned around Jewish texts and Jewish traditions and values? For us, remember that I think that we're arguing that if someone asks you, are you observant? You can actually give that. If someone asks Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we're going to see one of her answers to that question. She would actually say she's a very committed Jew. She would have said that throughout her life. Did she go to Shabbat services every week? No, she did not. Did she keep a kosher home? No, she did not. Did she, at the same time, every day, think about the most urgent matters that she learned from her tradition and she learned from her obviously deep learning of the law, her answer would have been over and over again, yes, yes, yes. So beautiful text from the Pirkei Avot, justice for those who have been denied justice. The quote in the Pirkei Avot is, the sword comes into the world because of justice denied, right? So everybody, we're all getting this, but here's a Talmudic text that reminds us about the power and the necessity to protest. So, so this is this amazing passage in the Babylonian Talmud that maybe you've heard, but it's just so powerful. And in Tractate Shabbat, so anyone who's able to protest the transgressions of one's household and doesn't is responsible and is in a sense held accountable for the deeds of one's household. Extend that to your town. Anyone who's able to protest against the wrongdoing in their town and doesn't, they're now culpable for the acts of the people in their town. Go even broader. Anyone who's able to protest against the injustices of the world, transgressions, I think it's fair to say injustices would be also a good loose translation of transgressions of the world, and doesn't, is punished for the wrongdoing of the world. Now, Rashi, our great commentator, who always wants to ask the right question, he says, what does it mean able to protest? Does it mean physically able? Like I can go outside and I can hold the sign, or I can go march with, you know, my fellow people committed to the cause? No. Rashi says it means that you believe that your protest could in fact move the needle. That's what it means that you could protest. Now, I love the Maharal of Prague, and if you ever go to Prague in the old Jewish cemetery, you can see his very elaborate tombstone. What he actually says, and this is a reframe of, for many people, what the urgent and most critical ordering of, remember, Talmud study, prayer, caring for our community with acts of chesed or justice. Look at what the Maharal, very traditional commentator and spiritual master, says. While a person may be individually pious, such good will pale in the face of the sin of not protesting against an emerging evil. Such a pious person will be accountable for having been able to prevent it and did not. A tzaddik, a righteous person who remains quiet and passive, is ultimately responsible for the communal evil which he or she could have and should have prevented. Friends, I'm not suggesting that this is the only part of the Jewish tradition, but I think we're living in a time when there are a lot of people among the Jewish community who would want to marginalize justice work as not really central, and would want to marginalize it as political partisanship as opposed to a fundamental of Jewish tradition. Let's go a little bit deeper, and these are going to be familiar. So by now, everyone knows the iconic photograph of Abraham Joshua Heschel marching in Selma with Dr. King and a whole group of interfaith leaders. And, you know, he got grief from, he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Before that, he taught at HUC in Cincinnati. And he got a little grief for what was he doing down in Selma? Is that what a brilliant professor ought to be doing with his time? Shouldn't he be teaching rabbinical students? Shouldn't he be writing some new tractate on something? So in answering it, he said, you know, I felt like my legs are not lips and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. It's an unbelievable statement. So how many of you, put your hand up, you've heard the phrase praying with my feet, right? It's now part of the iconic Jewish lexicon. And for us, okay, you gave a sermon, Rabbi, good. You taught a class, good. Did you actually get out there and put your feet on the pavement and take a stand, raise your voice? Turns out that Heschel was following 100 years later from Frederick Douglass, who many of us revisited his teachings. He was an abolitionist, a freed slave, and a remarkable philosopher and teacher. And 100 years before Heschel said he was praying with his feet, Douglas said, I've given all these sermons, I've given all these talks, I fought for freedom, I prayed for 20 years, he said, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. I'm not taking away from Heschel. Chas v'shalom, I would never do that. I'm saying there's a deep stratum of religious life that is about activism, and it's not less than study, right? We know that. We have those great teachings from the Talmud, which is better, study or practice? Study that leads to practice is always the one that we would use. Now let's go a little bit further in this. I thought when I found this from the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, I thought I'd hit the exact home run, because I thought for this class today, it wouldn't be as good to have it from the New York Jewish Week. I mean, if it says in the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, it's got to be purposeful. So this is by Rabbi Heschel's daughter, Susanna, a brilliant teacher, scholar at Dartmouth College. So at the 50th anniversary of the March in Selma, there was a whole set of things, including a movie called Selma. And Susanna writes, it's regrettable that the film presents the march as many today thought of it as a political protest. And she talked about her dad thinking that this was not a political protest. This was an act of religious conscience. And he goes into the specifics of it. She remembers her father saying, my father, when he marched in Selma with Dr. King, he said it was the greatest day of his life. And my father said, King said that. My father, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, he was reminded at Selma of walking with Hasidic Rebbes in Europe, where he had been born and raised. This is the category of social justice as a spiritual practice. If someone asked you tomorrow, a colleague said, what's your spiritual practice? And you said, I meditate, I pray every day, I study mystical text or Musar. My guess is we get a whole host of answers. What about if, when someone asked me my spiritual practice, what if I said, I'm a justice warrior. I follow in the footsteps of Abraham and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and many, many others. I think what we're seeing here is a redefinition of what it means to be a person of Jewish commitment and spiritual depth. That is also part of what we have when we think about these questions. So has anybody heard the name Rabbi David Saperstein before? Rabbi Saperstein is a Reform rabbi. He is an attorney, and for 40 years, he led the social justice work of the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. Most recently, he served as the U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom in the second Obama administration. He has one of the most beautiful statements about the connection of social justice to everything else. Not that it stands alone, but that it's part and parcel of a Jewish life of commitment. So he says the thread of social justice is so authentically and intricately woven into the many-colored fabric we call Judaism, that if you seek to pull that thread out, everything unravels. The Judaism that results is distorted, it's neutered, it's rendered aimless. This is an argument for not social justice above all else, but social justice as an intimate part of what we do. So Heschel says, if I pray and it doesn't move me to act in a bold and assertive way against pyramids of callousness and hatred, I would add racism and opportunism and falsehoods, then what was my prayer? And I think they are coming at it from two places. Can anybody recognize the picture? Whose picture is that? Again, it's hard to tell with all of us wearing masks who's wearing it, but the guy's wearing a Union for Reform Judaism baseball hat probably gives it away. It is yours truly. I'm not going to ask, because you're not all New Yorkers. If you were New Yorkers, I'd say, what avenue am I standing in? And the really advanced ones would say, oh, that looks like 6th Avenue. So it turns out this is a Shabbat back in June. It's right after the killing of George Floyd. After Shabbat morning services and Torah study, I decided that it was a Shabbat expression to pray with my feet. We did it socially distant. I want the photograph to reflect that we were not crowded together in a protest. People were very respectful of social distance. And I was there not in spite of it being Shabbat, not in spite of my being a rabbi, because it was Shabbat, because of the commitments of Shabbat, because of the commitments of Jewish life. So again, I'm not holding myself up as a model. I'm just saying the thinking that informs our Jewish practice and our Jewish commitments is, I think, best expressed in a more integrated way. So let's get a little bit more Ruth Bader Ginsburg. By the way, I love these pictures of her just sitting in her chambers thinking. Can you imagine what went on inside of that remarkable mind of hers? So it turns out there's a lot of attention being paid to her appreciation of dissent, right? She wrote a lot of the most famous dissents of the court, which meant, of course, they didn't carry the day. They weren't the rulings. They were the people who disagreed with the rulings. And she says something absolutely brilliant about dissent, that they are, look at this. The greatest dissents do become court opinions, and gradually over time, their views become the dominant view. So that's the dissenters' hope, that they are writing not for today, but for tomorrow. Look at the most powerful teaching from the 2,000-year-old Mishnah, the oldest stratum of Jewish law, where in our tradition, you always record the dissenting view. So the teaching is, why do you record the opinion of the single person who dissented against the many whose majority carried the argument? Why? Because down the road, the court may prefer the opinion of the single person and may depend a whole new ruling of Jewish law on that person. So this is about something that our Jewish community and our world could use a lot more of. The idea that we are respectful for those who hold different views and those who may have a different interpretation of Jewish law or may have a different way of expressing their Jewish commitment. Dissenting is a noble exercise for everyone. So I'm just going to finish up. Thanks for the little reminders. I want to just give you, this is my favorite picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's speaking at the Harvard Law commencement, and it's a bit of an impromptu thing. Does that look like, oh my God, just look at her. And I just had to throw up the Isaiah 58:1, which is the Haftarah for Yom Kippur morning. Raise your voice like a ram's horn. She had a quiet voice, but oh my God, like the shofar, it's echoing still. You know, we used to have our headquarters in New York City, and on the side of the building, we built the building for the Union American Hebrew Congregation. It says, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. Don't you always know the phrase, well, it's not cast in stone. Well, actually, sometimes it is. So when you go to work every day, that's not where our offices are anymore, 65th and 5th Avenue. But I imagine my predecessors going to work and every day looking at it and going, okay, what's the job today? What's the meeting schedule? Do justly. This is my last slide. My last slide is appropriate for today. We're remembering our judge, our teacher, our justice warrior. She was a Dayan. And when someone dies, our tradition teaches us to say, Baruch Dayan Hamet, blessed is the true judge. With Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it had a double meaning, obviously. And I just conclude this last slide with her teaching from the High Holidays, where she reflected, the Jewish religion is an ethical religion, she told a group of worshipers at 6th and I. That is, we're taught to do right, to love mercy, to do justice, not because there's going to be any reward in heaven or punishment in hell. We live righteously because that's how people should live, and not anticipating any award in the hereafter. You can take a million teachings from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't want to presume that these are the only ones, but let's spend the last moments together thinking about her life, our lives, and the life of our Jewish community. If more people identify justice as core to who they think they are as Jews, let's not start with that last, right? Why can't we begin to create more Jewish connection, more Jewish commitment, building on the thing that people already identify, which is fundamental to being Jewish. But this is a Jewish debate. So my view is not only one of the views. I think we have a chance to engage the next generation very deeply, but we better do it smartly. If they already care about justice, let's not neglect putting that right in the core. And let's be a Jewish community that stands for it. So let's have comments, questions. People can unmute. We're not such a large group that we can't unmute and hear each other's voices. So let's spend the last few minutes in conversation. What did you think? What resonated? What didn't? Floor is open. So let me hear some comments, questions. You get a chance to formulate. That's okay. Take a second. All right, who's going to lead us off? Come on.
Maggie.
Maggie, please.
I will. I always have a question. And I really appreciate, thank you very much, Rabbi Jacobs. That was really, really beautiful. And I think, this is something that I think about a lot, and I really appreciate the way you are framing the sort of the action in the spiritual practice. How, if you do sort of meld those two the way that you were saying, that in some ways action or social justice is part of our spiritual practice, how do we have room for the many different ways of social action? How do we define, how do we know when something rises to the level of social justice?
It's a great question, Maggie, and it's the hard one, but I do think it's the right one, because I think a lot of times what I hear is that social justice is already moving out of Judaism into the realm of political partisanship, right? You can't actually say that Judaism doesn't care about the poor. You simply can't say the Jewish tradition is not just filled with teachings about that. How we create policy that's most effective to care for the poor, that's a debate. That's a legitimate debate. But caring, doing that work, fundamental. Social action, I also think, is more often in chesed work, caring for people, feeding hungry people. I started a homeless shelter in Brooklyn. It was the first homeless shelter in a synagogue in New York City. That was fundamental to our work as a Jewish community, to care for the homeless. But then we actually asked ourselves, why are there so many homeless people? I bet Pittsburgh has a few homeless people as well. So social justice is trying to think more broadly about the policies that create a society. But I think we have to be very mindful of how we do this work today, because right away it can start a kind of a boxing match. And I think when we base it on core Jewish values, we're called to speak up on behalf of people whose voices aren't being heard. Ruth Bader Ginsburg oftentimes would say, I'm speaking for those who don't have a voice. I'm raising the judicial voice. So I think this is clearly part of the core of Judaism, but we get, as a Jewish community, a little bit contentious when we lose the underpinning, which is our textual and our value, bedrock of Torah, Talmud, and medieval codes. But I think, the argument has to be, this is fundamental. And a Judaism that doesn't have something to say about the most important issues facing the world, why would we think young people or anybody would make it the core of their lives? Judaism has something to say about everything. I mean, literally everything. And what's happening in the world, if Judaism doesn't have something to say, I am at a loss for what we're doing to reflect Judaism. All right, those are kind of agitational sermonics. Who's got, come on, we got lots of, I can just see people going. My colleague, Rabbi Crystal.
Yeah. Daryl Crystal.
Rick, I just want to say Yesher Koach. Having listened to many talks, but the way that you brought us the text and laid it out was just fantastic. So it was really, really amazing, and I especially love the Ruth Bader Ginsburg about speaking up and the importance of dissent in one generation becoming halacha in another. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, you don't have to be a Reform rabbi to ask a question, but it's great having Reform rabbis or any rabbis, and I'm obviously moved to see my colleague, Rabbi Myers, to be part of this study. Really inspired by your leadership. And we all are enormously grateful for all of the chesed and all of the love and all of the wisdom that you plant within this community and our wider Jewish community. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Another, who gets the last word? It shouldn't be the rabbi. It shouldn't be the teacher.
I don't want it. I hope this is not the last word. I just want to mention the conflict that I've been presented with, and it's many Jews do draw, like Justice Ginsburg, draw on their Jewish roots in terms of their interpretation of doing justice and activism in the world. Somebody asked me about our congregation, which was WRT, confirmation year, which is very much rooted in action. And the kids are out there and they're doing a lot of stuff and they're studying the text and all of those things. And she said, well, what's the difference with you're doing the same things we do in Girl Scouts? Now, I love Girl Scouts, but I was horrified and stumped.
Well, Michelle, thank you. First of all, it's great to see you. And, this is an international conversation, so thank you. And I know the depths of the question that's asked, and it's a real one. If, social action and social justice are community service, well, why do I have to be Jewish to do it? Everybody's doing it. Girl Scouts are doing it, right? Anybody go to college or high school outside of a Jewish institution? Learning is also, we do learning in university, so why would I do Jewish learning? The answer is there's a difference. I also would say one of the key differences for those of us who do justice work, to be replenished and renewed by our study and our prayer, because you know what, it is exhausting and sometimes dispiriting to be out there doing this work. And our tradition integrates it. Why do we eat maror on Pesach? It's not because we enjoy the taste of bitter herbs. Maybe some of you do enjoy it. It's supposed to wake us up. It's supposed to motivate us. So I love the Jewish tradition that's integrated. By the way, if you just pull out social action or social justice, Michelle, and have it stand alone, then exactly that critique is completely justified. But we argue for a more integrated Jewish life, like Rabbi, Saperstein. You pull out, one thread, the whole garment comes undone. And I think when we have a Judaism that's only social action or social justice, it's thin, it's not sustainable, and it won't help the practitioner renew the commitment to do it over and over again. So I think what's different is doing that work within a religious community and within a spiritual tradition that anchors it and renews it and in a sense focuses it. That's what's different. But by the way, Girl Scouts are good. And doing it in your civic engagement is good. But when we do it as Jews, we're actually doing something that is slightly different. When I do Torah study, as you do every Shabbat morning, Michelle, I'm doing something different than when I read a book of philosophy or I read a history book. I'm doing sacred study, and that anchors me in a different way. So I hope that begins to help. So again, Amy, Rabbi Bardak, I think we're probably coming to the conclusion, or maybe we've reached it. And
No, we're good. And I really want to thank you, Rabbi Jacobs. I found your teaching really inspiring, and I think you put words to not just the questions that were asked at the end, but so many of the issues that we're wrestling with to try to make Judaism relevant to our lives. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with our community at this time. And thanks for everyone for participating in the middle of a momentous week, an important day for us here in Jewish Pittsburgh. And we're going to be closing with a closing prayer, Kaddish D'Rabbanan. Marlene had put the link into the chat. We're not going to share the screen because the practice of the three congregations is that as a minyan is when you see 10 faces on the screen. So I am really pleased to invite Carol Black to lead Kaddish D'Rabbanan. Carol is a survivor of the attack, and she lost her twin brother, Richard Gottfried, and will be saying Kaddish D'Rabbanan in his memory. Please rise if you are able.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabah. B'yoma divra hirute v'yam lech melchute. B'chaye hon uvyame hon. Uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uvisman kari v'yamru amen. Yehe shmei rabba mavorach li'olam omei omaya. Yisbarach v'yishtabach v'yit poar v'yit ramam v'yit naseh. V'yit tadar v'yit talev v'yit talal shmei dekudasha barihu. Le'ela mim chol ber chatav eshiratav tush b'chatav v'nechematav damiram b'yamav yimru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanon v'al Tamidehon v'al kol Tamidehon v'al kol mund oskin b'iraita divi hadra hadain v'di b'chol atar v'atar yehe l'chan shlom rabba hina v'histachol v'rachamim v'hayin arichin u'mazon v'riha u'perkonim mikadam avuam divi shemaya v'yimru amen yehe shlom rabba min shemaya v'hayin tovim Elena v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Osei shalom b'mramav. Hu barachamav yasei shalom. Elena v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen.
Thank you, everyone. A good day in remembrance of our 11 lost. And if you'd like to stay on for Torah study,